also take up the questions of chapter 9, particularly the numerical example that we'll be discussing tomorrow. So I hope that all of you will be attempting those questions. Then it will be, our discussion is going to be much more fruitful if you have at least attempted those questions. Do you have any question from the previous lectures? Then I can first take up those and then move to the new chapter. Any question from chapter 9? All right. Let me actually then begin with the discussion on chapter 10. Let me first share screen. All right. So, okay. So this is something which should be visible to you. Essentially, this chapter is about deriving the ISLM curves and then basically discussing the policies on the basis of with the help of this particular framework. Now, essentially, keep in mind that IS curve is about the goods market equilibrium. It's all the Y and I combination which gives the goods market equilibrium. Essentially, I is entering into the goods market through this particular function where the investment is negatively related to the rate of interest. And investment being an important component of aggregate demand then, so given a level of rate of interest, and the given other autonomous consumption, then the aggregate demand and the consumption as a function of income, aggregate demand gets determined, and the point where the aggregate demand is equal to output is going to be the equilibrium level, which is what is going to give you the goods market equilibrium. So, for every I there is a Y, or for every Y there is a I, which puts goods market in equilibrium, and those Y-I combination is what we call the IS curve. So as you can see in this particular diagram, you have aggregate in this particular equation that you have aggregate demand, which is shown like this. I expect all of you to actually be doing these equations once on your own. Not very difficult, algebraically very, very simple. So what you have is that you have aggregate demand, which is autonomous consumption plus autonomous expenditure, plus a part of expenditure which is dependent on your income. So this is something which is part of the consumption which is not autonomous because it is dependent on Y. And then there is a part which is dependent on the rate of interest. This is the part of investment which is dependent on the rate of interest. And when we look at the autonomous consumption, the first one, you get essentially these terms. They are called autonomous because they are independent both of Y and I. And in that sense, these are autonomous. So what happens when the rate of interest actually declines? When the rate of interest declines, refer to the first equation that we had. Essentially, the rate of a decline in rate of interest, according to this equation, will cause the investment to increase. So when the investment increases, essentially, then what you see is that there is going to be a shift of this line. So from the blue line, you go to the black line because the investment, and if you look at it, it is essentially happening because of the change in the interest rate. Interest rate has declined. So I1 is high interest rate and I2 is low interest rate. And because of the decline in interest rate, the investment has increased, and that increase in investment means that for every level of Y, with a decline interest rate, the investment is higher, and because the investment is higher, the aggregate demand, instead of being on the blue line, it is on the black line. So that is the idea, and that is how this graph is drawn. So once we take this Y1, which corresponds to the goods market equilibrium when the rate of interest is I1, which is a higher rate of interest, and then take another pair, that is Y2, which corresponds to the rate of interest, which is a lower rate of interest, which is I2. Plot them, then you get the IS curve. So I1 and Y1 you have here, and then you also have, so this is one combination that you have, I1 and Y1, and the other combination is I2 and Y2, and that is how you are basically getting your IS curve. So it's pretty simple. It's all those YI combination which are making this goods market into equilibrium. This part should be actually clear. Is there any question about the IS curve which is not very clear? Any question? All right, then you have the multiplier which is derived then, and this multiplier is somewhat different because you have the rate of interest which is appearing. The multiplier is same as we had derived when we took investment to be completely autonomous, but now we know that the investment is something which is a function of the rate of interest also. So instead of A bar, the A bar, which is autonomous expenditure, will have a component of investment which is autonomous, but also a component which is function of rate of interest. So I think it is this should be actually pretty simple. Now, what causes shift in the IS curve? The shift in the IS curve, as you can see, that what are the things which will have caused a shift or the rotation of the IS curve? So one thing is that as you move from I1 to I2, look at the black line and the blue line, the ones which are not dotted. So rate of interest is declining and the income is actually increasing. So you get an IS curve which is black line like this. In the other cases, when you have the black dotted line and the blue dotted line, what is the change? The change is that the this propensity to consume, C, small c, has actually changed. So you had C here and you have C prime here. And similarly, with a different interest rate of interest, you have C here and a different C prime here. Now look at the diagram, and tell me which is actually higher. C is higher or C prime is higher? Both C and C prime have to be less than 1. They lie between 0 and 1. But which according to you is higher, C or C prime?
C prime.
C prime. And why is it so?
So because the slope is increased.
So it is higher. Is there any other answer?
Yeah,
someone who would want to elaborate on this? Why is C prime higher than C? The economics of it? Yes, indeed, slope is higher. So you can see that compare this black line and the black dotted line. So if this is the level of aggregate demand, everything else remaining the same, rate of interest is same, government expenditure is same, export minus import is same, then the aggregate demand depends on the consumption. So if you have consumption is this, then it shows a lower marginal propensity to consume. Whereas if the consumption is actually so for this level of income, aggregate demand is this because your marginal propensity to consume is actually low. So aggregate demand is low. Whereas if for the same level of income, if you have, and same level of rate of interest, if you have higher marginal propensity to consume, then the aggregate demand is also going to be higher. So this higher aggregate demand is something which causes this kind of rotation. Since how much this from black to the dotted black, how much shift will take place will depend on how much the consumption is increasing, and that itself is a function of Y. So higher the Y, higher will be the increase in consumption because of the change in marginal propensity to consume. And that is why the gap between the two lines is actually increasing over a period of time. So this is something which then has to be understood, that why you have such things I mean, you have rotation sometimes, or the shift sometimes, that actually takes place. Had there been an increase in the autonomous component, there would have been a parallel shift of this particular line. Similarly, the IS curve, for the same reason as I described above, is actually here, it is shown as a rotation. Had there been a autonomous component, increase in the autonomous component of the aggregate demand, the IS curve would have also shifted in a parallel way. So this is something which is algebraically not very difficult to actually see. But what I would want you to do is that when you are actually reading this, then don't just look at the algebra, but also think the economics behind it. Either way, it is the right approach, but you should actually never forget the economics. That will kind of help you revise the economics that you have done again and again. All right. So you get this equation, which is the relationship between the rate of interest and y. I'll not explain it because this is really pure algebra that is involved, and you can actually do it. In case you are stuck with any of these equations, then you let me know. I will be responding to that particular thing. So I was just talking about it. So this is the thing when there is a IS is actually shifting because of the change in the autonomous spending. So when you have the autonomous spending, then there is a shift like this, and the IS curve will be shifting in this way. Again, this is something you can do the recap. It's not a bad idea to, while you're reading the chapter, then you do the recap. Now, similarly about the LM curve. Now, LM curve, as this actually clearly shows, it's a combination of interest rate and the output level where money supply is equal to money demand. So that is the idea. Remember, so what is happening with the LM curve? You have a money demand equation, which is given by this particular equation. Why do we write this equation like this is something which we have in the past discussed in quite detail. You can have the multiple interpretation of this, but for the time being, what we will do is that we will take the mathematical version of it and keep it at a general level. Any specific interpretation we will get into whenever there is such requirement. Till then, we will take this to be the general thing, because what I had done in the past is that I had actually explained this money demand equation both in terms of the monetary economics and the Keynesian economics, and both are quite drastically different, with very different implication also in certain situation, particularly in the situation of liquidity trap. But then, we will ignore that difference until we discuss those things. So there is a attempt to actually make a general framework in which both monetarism and Keynesian can be discussed. And till we have this, until the differences actually come up, it's not a bad idea that we actually continue with that thing. So this is the equation for demand for money. Essentially, it's the same equation that you have. This is drawn here. What is done is that what is shown is that relationship between L and I. So relationship between L and I is explored. So naturally, you have to assume then that Y is fixed at certain level. So as you can see that in this diagram, the first line, which is a very dark line, you have certain level of Y, which is Y1. And in the second line, then you have Y2. So this Y1 and Y2 are two different level of income. And for different level of income, then naturally there is going to be a different relationship between the rate of interest and the money demand. Nothing new, essentially representing the same equation that we had actually just discussed. So the money market equation, where money supply is equal to money demand, and this is a crucial point where it must be reminded that the money supply is here. We are talking about the real money supply. So this is your real money supply. So this P bar should not be ignored. And the right hand side is the money demand. And if we are talking about the real money supply, then it has to be equal to the real money demand. And which means that there are two ways in which we can look at Y. One can look at it as the real income, or the other thing is that one can look at it as the nominal income but keep prices as fixed, which is basically pretty much saying that it is real income. So what we will do is that we will take Y to be nominal income, but we will also assume that prices are fixed. Why we are doing that instead of taking it as a real income, it will become clear in a while when we actually vary the prices. So when we vary the prices, essentially the left-hand side is going to change, and then we will be doing certain derivations out of that. From this equation, then you get this particular equation, equation 7a of your reading, where the rate of interest is some function of y and some function of the money supply. As you can see from here itself, that an increase in y will cause rate of interest to increase, an increase in the money supply, MR by P, real money supply, will cause the rate of interest to decline, something which is intuitive and is what we actually expect. Now, I have no idea how to show this diagram, but possibly you can, if you're watching it on your mobile phone, you can actually rotate it. So essentially what you have is that between the black, the black line, the dark one, and the light line one, both are money demand. Here you have the money balance, and here you have rate of interest. So, but the two are basically showing different level of income. So when income increases, the money demand will increase, and naturally then for a given level of real money supply, the rate of interest is going to be higher. And that is how you are, in some sense, deriving the LM curve. So for each level of Y1, you see that what is the equilibrium rate of interest. What is rate of interest for each Y, what is the rate of interest, which will give you the equilibrium between the money supply, real money supply, and the real money demand. So this is how you are actually getting the LM curve. So LM curve then represents the equilibrium in the in the money market. This is it. What happens when there is an increase in real money supply? When there is an increase in real money supply like this, then the LM curve will be shifting to the right. This is also something which you can actually easily do, and you can look at it in mathematics also. Is there any question before we come to the equilibrium in both market and the money market? If you have any question, we can actually discuss it now. Is there any question? Nothing? Okay, so what you have is the IS curve, LM curve, and you have this as the equilibrium level of output and the rate of interest. What is assumed is that the equilibrium will be completely equilibrium will be reached immediately in the money market. In the goods market, it is going to take time. So basically, what one is trying to say here is that suppose you are, to begin with, you are at this point, and so what is going to happen is that immediately there will be equilibrium, and you are going to reach to this point. So money market equilibrium is reached immediately. It's a very fluid market. Goods market equilibrium actually takes time. How can you show that the goods market goods market equilibrium will be reached. What will happen at this point? Once you reach this point, what is going to happen? Anyone who want to explain? So suppose you start with here at this point, and uh, so okay. So what is happening is that you were at this point, at the red point, and then you immediately jump to this point. So that money market is in equilibrium. Now what will happen? How the adjustment will take place? Would anyone like to explain this thing? What happens to good market? Let's go step by step. What happens to the goods market and why? So now that you are at this point, what happens in the goods market and why? Yes? Anyone? Anudhi. I is that the real name or Anudhi? Give me the answer.
So I'm still thinking.
Is Anudhi your name or something else? You've written Anudhi there.
No, sir. That's my name. Earlier it was AS. Recently, the login ID name was AS. Now I changed it to Anthi.
Okay. So who would want to explain? See what is happening here. Let's see that what is happening in the goods market. For the goods market, you can see that if your one can actually look at it in different ways. So what one is saying is that essentially your output is here. Output is here. Now at this level of output, the rate of interest has to be this much for the goods market to be in equilibrium, for aggregate demand equal to aggregate output. But the rate of interest is actually higher. So if the rate of interest is higher, then that means the investment is lower than what would give the equilibrium in the goods market. So the aggregate demand is actually falling short of output. So what happens when aggregate demand falls short of output? So at this point, essentially, what you have is that aggregate demand, at this point, aggregate demand is falling short of output, because for the aggregate demand to be equal to output level this, the rate of interest should have been this, but the rate of interest here is at a higher level. So if the aggregate demand is falling short of output, then what is going to happen? There is going to be a decline in output. So the output is going to actually moves like this. So output will be going down, right? And what happens that each time the output, because that movement of output is actually a slow movement. So in each period, or whatever, you can think of period as a week or as a month, or since you are in a lockdown period as 3 weeks, whatever you have for each time you have a decline in output, money demand is going to change, because output is something which determines the money demand also. And as the money demand is changing, so what is happening? Money demand will decline. Output is declining, so the money demand is declining. And as the money demand is declining for a given level of money supply, then the rate of interest is also going to decline. So on the one hand, you have a movement of output like this. On the other hand, you will have a movement of rate of interest in this direction, right? So basically, if you take this movement and this movement combined, essentially you are talking about a movement which is basically happening like this. So this is the movement one has in mind. So slowly there is a movement to the equilibrium point. So this is actually how you are reaching to equilibrium. So you should try and argue it for a couple of more points, that what if economy is here or here or here, and apply the same principle. I think then it is going to be quite easy. I mean, it's really not difficult. Just keep in mind that the money market will be adjusting immediately. So you are always on LM curve in some sense, but that is not true for the IS curve. The output shift is going to be slow. There is no mathematical reason for that. It's just that this is how in the economies things would be actually working. All right. So all right. Okay. So this is the equilibrium that you have, and later, as someone had asked the other day also, that what happens if the government actually, instead of fixing the money supply, in this whole framework we are assuming that the government is actually fixing the money supply. But that may not be the case. Government may be actually fixing the rate of interest and adjusting the money supply according to that. So those are the cases which, for the time being, I'm going to postpone. Later, towards the end of it, I'll take it up and describe it, because that is something which is much more interesting from the policy point of view. But we will be actually applying this very framework of the equilibrium in the goods market and the money market. So this studying this is going to be quite useful. Now, some of the shifts that are discussed: autonomous spending, shift the IS curve to the right like this, and then you will have the new equilibrium, which is like this. I'll not repeat myself again that how the autonomous spending increase is going, shifting the IS curve. That is something which I've already spoken about. And now, until you actually tell the story completely to yourself, you have really not understood it. So there's no point actually going on repeating the same thing. All right. What we have here is, in this particular diagram, this is what is diagram figure 1013, is that we are trying to derive the AD curve. So AD curve, remember, is a curve which is between y here, and this y, remember, has to be real y. So let me actually call it, just to make sure that you don't actually forget it. Let me actually say that this is real output. This is not the nominal output. And this is the price level. Sorry. This is, all right. So this is your price level. So it's a relationship. Aggregate demand is actually a relationship between the P and the output level. So, and we had actually earlier also derived a negatively sloped AD curve. Any of you remember what was the logic behind negatively sloped AD curve? What was the logic? Earlier we had talked about the AD curve being negatively sloped. So this is one framework, ISLM, that we'll be deriving it. I'll just explain it right now. But earlier also we had actually talked about it. Do you remember that? What was the logic of downward sloping AD curve? As a matter of fact, we had said something more. What we had said is that what is happening? That the AD curve is going to be like this, which is basically a rectangular hyperbola. So, but it was negatively sloped nevertheless. And now we have this. So, how did we had, what made us say that it is going to be a rectangular hyperbola? Anyone?
So Pi is constant.
Pardon?
Pi is constant.
Is constant?
The price level, the product of the price level and the output.
Output is constant.
No, the product of the price level and the output, according to the equation, MB is equal to PY.
But why? Why should, I mean, that I know, that is rectangular hyperbola. That is the definition of rectangular hyperbola. But why is that a rectangular hyperbola? That is the question.
So because
Sir,
Yes, Amol?
yes, sir. So basically, we know that the equation, mv is equal to py, and we had assumed that the velocity of money would be constant, and for a given constant level of money supply, that is m bar upon p bar. Sorry, m bar into
For a
v
constant,
that
if
was
if
constant.
the
We had
if the amount, if the money supply
yes,
is
yes,
constant, you are correct, and if the velocity is constant, then the py is constant, right?
yes,
And
sir, yes,
this is
yes,
basically drawing py is constant. So essentially, you
yes,
can draw py to be constant, to be a rectangular hyperbola, which is negatively sloped naturally. If you are actually following quantity theory of money and you are assuming money supply to be constant. But now we are actually using somewhat different here. What we are doing is we are using ISLM framework. So I am not saying that velocity of money is constant or anything like that. What I am saying here is essentially that what happens that suppose there is an increase in price, right? So this increase is going to cause the real money supply to decline. M by P will decline because P is increasing. So naturally, then we know that the LM curve will be shifting to the left. So there is going to be this kind of shift because the P has actually declined. So this shift means that you have a different new equilibrium. So there is going to be a shift like this, and this shift is basically because the prices have increased. So and when this shifts happen, then essentially what happens that the y is actually declining like this, right? So if there is an increase in price from P1 to P2, now P1 and P2 is not visible in this graph, but what it is doing is it is causing the real money supply to go down, and hence the LM curve to be shifting like this. So this is what we have actually done. So there is a shift like that, and this shift causes the output to actually decline. So this is something which then is drawn here, that when you have moved from P1 to P2, the output is declining from Y1 to Y2, and that is how you are getting the aggregate demand curve. Here we are simply saying that it is negatively a slope. We are not insisting on the rectangular hyperbola, but the aggregate demand curve is negatively sloped. This can be actually, one can actually reach here. Not necessarily, for that it is not necessarily to have the quantity theory of money. Even without quantity theory of money, with a more acceptable, more general version of money supply and money demand, we can actually reach here. Yes. Is there any question? Okay, so this is about deriving the aggregate demand curve. This is going to be useful in some of the situations. It is going to be useful. If I ask you the question, what is happening to the money supply here? Remember, the money supply is constant. This shift from LM1 to LM2, this shift has taken place basically because of the increase in prices. The nominal money supply is actually kept constant. So while we are actually drawing the aggregate demand curve, what we have to keep in mind that the nominal money supply is constant, and it is actually same in case of the other year also. So I think we are finishing with the time, and this is 12:34. Let me actually, should we continue for a while, or should we actually, let me, what I will do, this timing is slightly bad for me because we are starting late, but what I will do is that I will fix up another time which is not going to be very different. Maybe instead of 11:50, I'll make it 11:40 or 11:30. Is that fine for all of you? Can I make it to 11:30 or something? Then we'll have more time at this point of thing. Will that work? Sansita, do you think it will work? You can speak on behalf of others.
Yes, sir. I think it will work.
It will work. So let me actually speak to those people, and I will then fix up the timing.